Friends, welcome from downtown Fayetteville and Stories from the Center. I'm David Blackman here with Justin Barrier today, and we are coming from the gymnasium of Hayes Street United Methodist Church on this rainy afternoon. More rain today. It's been a rainy season for us. Friends, as always, we like to start off with what we're about. We believe a podcast can facilitate helpful and holy conversation concerning justice, freedom, and peace. These are real concerns for the Fayetteville community, especially as our city continues to navigate our history, our present realities, and our future possibilities. Participants, guests, will reflect on what justice means, the connection freedom has within our community, as we are uniquely positioned to our neighbors at Fort Bragg, and the desire to live together in peace. Through seeking the stories of our people, we will find and celebrate the places where justice, freedom, and peace intersect, and we hope inspire listeners to practice the same. Our key question that we ask all of our guests is, when telling your story, how have justice, freedom, and peace impacted your life? Friends, it's with great joy that I welcome today our special guest, Dr. Hank Parfitt, to the podcast. And Hank's a retired medical doctor here in Fayetteville, serves as the current president of the Lafayette Society of Fayetteville, and which has recently established an endowment to study the age of revolutions, the emancipation and civil rights eras, and we are so thankful for the good work that the Lafayette Society is engaged with. Along with his wife, Diane, they are co-owners of City Center Gallery and Books right here in downtown, and they're members of the Downtown Alliance. I've had the blessing of learning from Hank. He's the expert historian in my mind of all things Fayetteville. Invited myself and Jackie to a historic carriage ride that absolutely blew my mind and opened up my heart for the love of this community. He's a big believer in realizing and recognizing the importance of our namesake, the Marquis de Lafayette, and I consider him a friend and a true ambassador of this great city. Hank, it's a great joy to welcome you to Stories from the Center today.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, amen. So we want to get right into it this afternoon, friends, and as we always do, we look forward to hearing stories about our guests and what they sense about freedom, justice, and peace. I want to start with justice today. Hank, you've been a longtime advocate for downtown Fayetteville and an ambassador for the city. You've got this passion for all things regarding the Marquis de Lafayette, and as the president of that society, I would love for us to start today's podcast with maybe a story about what Lafayette and justice have to do with each other.
Sure. First, I want to say thank you for having me on your show today.
Yeah, amen.
And I appreciate your interest in the history of Fayetteville that led to your taking the historic tour by horse and carriage. Mm-hmm. So many people, we have a lot of people who come to Fayetteville and stay a few years and then they leave for another assignment. And I'm just so delighted when people who are new to town come down and do that historic tour. And it's amazing the number of people that were moving to Fayetteville. We're talking about prior COVID here. Right. But we would talk to our guests on the carriage and find out that so many of them were from out of state. And we had visitors who were visiting relations here in Fayetteville. They may be from California or Massachusetts or Florida. But they wanted to learn about our community. And it's just, to me, gives me great pride in the town that I live in to know that our history goes back to before the Revolutionary War. And I mean, we've got the documentation, we've got the facts, we've got the names of the people that preceded us here in this little spot in North Carolina.
Sure.
And it just, it makes it so much more fun for me when people come to the table to find out more about this community.
Those are the Campbellton Landing kind of stories, right?
Right, exactly.
Love learning about that, Hank. Love learning about that. So jump ahead to this era of the Marquis de Lafayette
Sure.
coming and being a part of that, and how does that connect to who we are today?
Well, I think that's a good question because in many ways we think of Lafayette as this young nobleman who came here in 1777 when he was only 19 years old to fight with America for its freedom from England. And he had military training. He came from a long line of military men. One of his ancestors fought with Joan of Arc. Mm-hmm. So he was the nobility of the sword, they called it in France. He had heard about this experiment democracy here in America, so he provisioned his own ship and against the orders of the king came to America. which is just like something a 19-year-old would do,
Sure,
right? Yeah.
sure.
They say don't go, so what I'm going to do. I'm going to go.
Right.
And he became a major general. Was probably George Washington's most respected general. He valued him very much. He had something like 9 different military engagements that he led and was never defeated. A couple of strategic retreats, but was never defeated.
Wow.
The big victory was Yorktown, of course, in 1781, which was a pivotal battle which essentially won the Revolutionary War for us. Sure. His influence with the king to send over 5,000 or 6,000 troops and ships to blockade the York River was absolutely essential for that victory. So he was, in military terms, just a giant that so few of us recognize. And it's only when you look at the history and realize that without the French help, without Lafayette, we probably would not have won that war.
And he was young. I mean, he was in his 20s doing all this.
He was. I mean, it's
remarkable.
And nowadays, somebody who's 21, 22, they're still on their skateboard and haven't found a job yet. I don't mean to say that in a critical way.
No.
Our young people have a lot of promise, but things were different then, and you did grow up a lot younger. Right. So he was already pretty mature by that time. And so, we've told the story over and over again about Lafayette and his military exploits and what he did for our country. What we don't often talk about is the justice that he sought for all people. When he came to America, he did not know really anything about slavery. France was a free soil state, so there were no slaves in France. They had slaves in their colonies, but of course he wasn't living in the colony. Right. So he came, his focus was on helping America win the war. But he went back to France and thought, we were fighting for freedom, but how come 1/6 to 1/5 of the population is enslaved? And that's what we were fighting for? I mean, what about them?
Sure.
So it bothered him greatly. And
it was a justice issue for him.
Very much justice. How can you, if you look at justice, perhaps one of the most unjust things you can think of is to own another human being. It was accepted at the time by the majority of people. There were some people who recognized it as not something that humans should be doing, recognized it, in fact, as an abomination. And it really bothered him greatly to the point that he bought a plantation in South America with the idea of teaching the slaves how to read, teaching them how to value their work so that when they went out as free men, they knew what to charge for their labors. And very liberal policy. And before he could enact that wonderful scheme to set an example, the French Revolution seized all his properties. But he was very idealistic. So his thought was, I could buy a plantation and free the slaves, or I could show the world that you can run a plantation with wage labor, that you can pay people to work for you and still make a decent living. Yeah. So it was a grand experiment. It was very, very idealistic. George Washington praised him mightily for that. Lafayette tried to talk Washington into freeing his slaves. He finally wrote into his will that they would be freed upon his death. So here's an example of a man that truly walked the walk and did what he could to help right a grievous wrong.
Sure. And lived it.
And he lived it. He was able to get voting rights, equal rights for people of color in France. His Declaration of the Rights of Man was adopted from the Declaration of Independence, became the charter by which they govern in France. So he became a symbol of freedom and justice for the black man, and was praised long after his death by the abolitionists as being a true abolitionist. And by that they meant that he not only believed in emancipation, he believed that there should be no slavery, he also believed in treating people of color as equals. And his sense of justice extended to the American Indians. He supported rights for the American Indians. Feminism had not come into play about 100 years before that, before it did. But he promoted female authors, which was almost unheard of. He also advocated for prison reform. He himself spent 5 years in prison after the radical elements of the French Revolution tried to arrest him, and he would have probably ended up being guillotined.
Wow.
But he fled to present-day Austria, and the authorities there locked him up because of his revolutionary ideas.
Sure.
They were a monarchy, and they were afraid that he would foment revolution in their country. So he was in prison for 5 years. And he was a vocal opponent of a solitary confinement. So any number of areas of justice.
Yep.
If you have trouble thinking of somebody, if you said Lafayette, you'd be right.
He's covering a lot of it. I like your idea of a revolutionary figure and somebody who just was, the phrase we oftentimes hear, a man before his time. I mean, he had such vision for being such a young guy and having such ideals and doing all he could to live out those ideals.
Right.
That he was able to practice that and put into practice some of these ideals of which he lived by. Hank, where do you think that came from? Like, what was his story? How did he have all these what was stirring within his soul to always be looking ahead?
That is really a great question. And I have read that the fact that his father died in battle against the British when Lafayette was 2 years old. So he was reared in the countryside in southern France. His father had a big castle there. It wasn't very fancy, but it was a castle. But he was reared by his aunts. His mother was she was the nobility of Versailles.
Okay.
And she was friends with the king and queen and that sort of thing. And so she was there, and she eventually brought him up to Versailles when he was 12 or 13. But prior to that, he was reared by a couple of aunts.
Okay.
And it may be that feminine influence affected him.
Sure.
I mean, he was all boy. I mean, he was out hunting in the woods and stuff like that.
Sure.
But it may have made him think more about things like respect for others.
Right.
And I think another factor was who he met when he came to America. And another young man in the Army, the Continental Army, was John Laurens from South Carolina. And his father owned slaves. And he was about Lafayette's age. And they talked, about freedom and democracy and what this meant. And as young guys want to talk about these radical concepts. I mean, if you remember that when over cold beer or something, you talk about or like in the dorm late at night.
Right.
And so they were talking about these concepts of freedom and equality and how do we rid the world of slavery.
Right. And he worked toward that.
He did.
And he worked toward that. Like, that was beyond just the cold beer in the tavern. It was working towards that to help bring about that change for people's lives. Yeah. Hank, you've spoken about freedom in that last bit there, and that's another important theme for us. And what about freedom? And what story of freedom comes to your heart around this ideal of how are people free and how are we living free?
Right. Well, it's in so many dimensions. And, of course, most governments were monarchies when Lafayette grew up in France. And this was the age of revolutions, late 1700s. And freedom to make your own decisions, freedom to have some control over your own life we take that for granted. It's pretty basic, but it wasn't that basic then. And even if you were not a slave, if you had no education, you didn't come from a family of means, you were just a laborer. To learn a trade and make some money, you had to be recommended, and depending on your background and your station in life, you may not even have that opportunity. So freedom is about choice, and when you're born into that poverty like that, you don't have a lot of freedom. So his advocacy for democracy is probably one of the most fundamental things that you can say he did to promote freedom. Okay. And it wasn't just in America. It wasn't just in France. It was in Poland. It was in South America.
Okay.
Wherever there was a revolution occurring, I forgot to mention Greece. 1810, 1815 time frame. Wherever there was a revolution in the world, he was supporting that. And the power of his word, his speech, his written word, was valued greatly. And this was what the leaders of that revolution were looking for. He was, beyond the age where he'd go there and fight, but just his support was incredibly meaningful.
His reputation mattered.
Exactly.
So it preceded him. So those words did matter because they were speaking from experience and how he had led and been involved in other revolutions.
Exactly.
Wow.
Right.
Good.
So it was about national determinism that because there were so many European nations who colonized other countries.
Right.
So it was about that country like Greece having their own national independence, as well as citizens having their independence.
Sure. Hank, what gave you, where did this passion come from for you to just fall in love with Lafayette? Like, how did that start for you?
I don't know. That's a good question, because I didn't have a really good history teacher in high school or even college.
Okay.
And I think most people are not necessarily going to be that interested in history. I mean, that's pretty normal. When you're young, you're thinking about the present and your future. So I think for most of us, it's only when you've lived life yourself that you begin to have an abiding interest in history. So I think that was part of it. And honestly, when I was asked to join the Lafayette Society, I was not that big a fan of history. But that kind of came about in an interesting way.
Okay.
I was looking at a book of events. It lists all the events throughout the year, and we were using that at the bookstore. Say what was the date of Walt Whitman's birth? Well, then we could feature a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman. Well, I looked. I was here in Fayetteville. And I figured, okay, I didn't know much about Lafayette, but I looked up Lafayette, and it said that his year of birth was 1757. Well, I'm not a mathematical genius, but I did some quick math, and I said, that means in 2007 it'll be his 250th birthday. Wow. I mean, that could be one outrageous event.
Sure.
So I had been working with Bruce Dawes through the Downtown Alliance. I say, Bruce, how about, I think the city ought to do this celebration for Lafayette's 250th. He said, oh, yeah, great idea. Great idea. And I kept pestering. And then, a year later, I'm invited to join the Lafayette Society, which I didn't even know much about.
Okay.
It had kind of a low profile in the community.
Okay.
And so I was asked to join, 2005. And at the very first meeting, Martha Dewell, who was the founder, said, okay, we're going to have a 250th birthday celebration for Lafayette's birthday. And we're going to ask Dr. Parfitt here to head that committee.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Great.
And we did. We had a committee of 20 different community groups, either government agencies, private groups, schools, post office, arts council, art museum, you name it.
Sure.
Spent 2 years planning for this event. And I felt like there's no way I can do this without learning more about Lafayette. Mm-hmm. So I began reading about him. And the very first book that I read, I just came away with the sense that Lafayette was a very admirable figure. And he was likable. Mm-hmm. Some people in history, you don't like him so much.
Right.
but you couldn't help but like Lafayette. And I really got buzzed on the history, and it led to an interest in history that I really didn't have before.
Sure. Well, we're thankful that you have that buzz, because it's a buzz that it's infecting all of us here in this community.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that.
And I would say that the Lafayette Society has certainly become a higher profile in this community, and certainly more folks know about it.
We have. Yeah. And I mean, we're more than just a dusty old historic organization. And one of my board members approached me, and this was 7 or 8 years ago, and I think I had just become president, and said, I don't really quite understand. I'm on the board, I'm glad to help, but I don't really quite understand what our purpose is. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh, that's a problem.
Sure.
If our board member doesn't understand, then how about the public? That's right. So we started looking at how we could take on some civic responsibilities. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to us that why don't we promote some of these things that Lafayette stood for?
Sure.
Like his leadership, like his generosity. Mm-hmm. He spent his entire fortune helping Americans win the war against England. And that's not inconsiderable, because at a time he was the wealthiest orphan in all of France, if not all of Europe. Wow. But his was also a generosity of spirit. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that comes into the justice idea. Sure. So we looked at leadership, and we sponsor the Hugh Shelton leadership program at Methodist. We sponsor a student in that. We work with the leadership Fayetteville Chamber of Commerce to provide them with a biography.
Right.
Each member gets a biography on Lafayette, each student, I should say. We have a Lafayette Leadership Award for the Non-Commissioned Officers Academy out at Fort Bragg for the upcoming Master Sergeants that have to take a 3-week course in leadership. So those are some of the examples. And then, we looked at the fact that we have an endowment at Methodist, and we have had for a number of years, and it's grown wonderfully. And that was good, but we thought, well, why not do one for Fayetteville State?
Right.
So
Lafayette would certainly be for that.
He would be very much for that. Mm-hmm. So 3 years ago, we established an endowment. We are in the process of funding it. We're almost there. We have to hit a minimum of $25,000. Okay. We're almost there. We also donated a lending library to the students for some textbooks and other written works that may not be in the library on campus that they would have to order. So instead of doing that, they can just get it right off the shelf in a section that's reserved for the history students at Fayetteville State. And we did that. We're doing this without the endowment now, because you can't use your endowment until it has been established.
Sure.
And build up. So it's just board members basically just reached in their wallet and funded this $1,500 lending library.
Following the generosity of Lafayette, as you said.
Exactly.
So that's wonderful, living into that. Yeah. That's wonderful. Hank, this idea about peace, if we can move to that theme for a moment. I know that you are a man of peace, and I've seen that, I've observed that, I've read that about you. And as much as Lafayette was involved in the military, right, I also sense that with his ideals, he wanted peace. Mm-hmm. He desired that for all people. And there was a particular story that I was really struck by in the midst of the unrest, the demonstrations, the protests here during the summertime months after George Floyd. And I think that that story that really resonated with me about when folks were moving down Hay Street and all of the energy that evening that was happening, and you and Diane are outside City Center Gallery, and you're engaging with that movement and having conversations. Would you be willing to talk to us a little bit more about that, and what was going through your mind, and the emotions that might have been playing out that night for y'all?
I don't mind, David, and I think energy is a good word. There's a lot of energy.
Absolutely.
Some of it negative, but
sure.
I think in many ways positive too. It was a difficult time. As we know, George Floyd had just been killed, and those images were just horrific. And I think the whole nation was on edge. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, a few days before the riots on the 29th of May, I had asked our bookstore manager to post a picture of a homeless person who is acting very, very strange, going in and out of shops. And we do that in the downtown lines to let people know, this guy, if he comes, just call the police and
Sure.
say that you don't feel good.
A neighborhood watch type
neighborhood
thing.
watch type thing. Well, someone saw that and took offense at it and said that we were being racist. They obviously don't know me and Diane very well.
Right.
And I mean, we were just excoriated because it was on the internet. I mean, we got phone calls from people in Kansas just ranting on the phone, calling us the worst names you can imagine.
Sure.
I mean,
Sure.
it was horrific. I mean, and obviously I felt bad because I was, the trigger of that, even though it was all good intentions.
Right.
So when that Saturday the 29th came along, I'm thinking, okay, maybe I should stand out front, and not that I could do much against a mob,
Right.
but maybe it would be a deterrent, And so around 2 o'clock that afternoon, because we'd heard things were coming down at 3 o'clock. That's when things were going down.
Right.
And so we were watching what happens, and the police cars were stationed in various places downtown, and then they magically disappeared. They were asked to pull back. So people starting to come down, and there were, at one point, probably over 1,500 people around the market house.
Okay.
And they were loud and they were angry, which I think is appropriate.
Sure. Hank, can I interrupt for a second to give some context about the market house in downtown Fayetteville for some listeners that may not know Fayetteville? Your location with City Center Gallery and Books is only a few shops away from the market house, so you can hear and you can see all that's happening. Just to give our listeners a sense of that context.
Maybe 50, 60 yards away.
Sure.
They were not terribly organized, and whenever there's a mob, you have this unease because right below the surface there's a lot of tension, and right below that it could explode.
Sure.
At that point, it did, and the group started going up the street. Now during this time, I'm standing there in front of the store. Diane's inside, and I'm thinking, well, why don't I just talk to these people, instead of just standing here? So I'd see somebody go, I say, hey, how you doing? And that is all it took, David.
Yeah.
That's all it took.
Just that one word of just, how's it going? How's it going?
And I would say the vast majority of these were good people. And later on, after they'd gone to the police station, people came in who were probably from outside the community.
Right.
There were a lot of spectators driving down Hay Street. Hay Street became a parking lot. People there, watching what was going on, and
Sure.
it got more and more rowdy.
Sure.
But we continued to stand out in front. Periodically, Diane would come out, and we would talk to people. We knew, a lot of people we knew. A lot of people we didn't know, just total strangers.
Sure.
And I remember in particular when Diane was out there with me, this young African-American man comes up. I think he was military. He's probably late 20s.
Okay.
And we were having some pretty deep conversation about race. What is racism like in Fayetteville? What's today like? George Floyd? I mean, we got pretty deep talking. And a young man came up, couldn't have been more than 18 or 19, a man of color, young man, said, do y'all mind if I just come and join your talk? And he mainly just listened.
Wow.
And we talked for 30 minutes, David.
So right there in the midst of all that happening that evening, there's a threesome.
Yeah.
Having a moment of peace together.
And we're learning from each other.
Right.
And at the end, when he was ready to leave, he said, I came down here planning to do something to your building, but I won't now. I don't want to. And so that made us feel pretty good.
So an owner willing to engage in the folks that may have come with different intentions, but then look what happens in that moment of transformation through a story.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think we learned from it. Fortunately, we never got a brick. The one door down,
Sure.
they got 2 or 3 bricks.
Right.
So I don't know if that was it or not, but regardless, it was a good experience for us, and presumably for some of the people that we spoke with.
Right. Hank, I think it's remarkable that you just described it as a good experience. And I think that that's the piece is that, that when as that continues to be a part of our navigating our current and present realities, Many of us here in Fayetteville know that the Market House continues to be a topic of hot discussion. And I think that we hope, our efforts with the podcast is just to help people, encourage people to tell stories.
Sure.
Certainly that's our goal here with the podcast, but we hope that this will inspire other folks to do what happened outside your shop.
Yeah.
And for folks that didn't know each other to have a conversation and to learn from each other.
Right.
I believe that's what's going to move us forward. I mean, that's the goal of moving this needle that we keep talking about. We want to move that needle in the right direction, and I think through stories that can happen, and it is happening. I mean, to your example. Yeah.
And I think it takes effort. I read somewhere they used to celebrate Emancipation Day here in Fayetteville. It was always on January the 1st. Now we're talking about, late 1800s.
Sure.
And this one speaker was from the western part of the state. And he's saying, the black man knows the white man pretty well. We've been cooking y'all's food, washing your clothes, listening to your conversations, because they were treated like furniture, and the white guys would sit around and talk all kinds of stuff, and just it was like, the servant wasn't even there.
Right.
And so we know y'all pretty well, but y'all don't know us.
Right.
And at some point, if you get to know the black man, then we can talk. We can have a conversation. And I think that's important, Dave, because, there's a lot of information out there during Black History Month. Mm-hmm. And I hope that white people like me will not just be passively receiving that, but look at something that interests you and dig a little further and get a book on. I mean, the internet, be careful, Wikipedia, they're not always accurate.
Sure.
But look at good historical resources on that topic and read about the way people of color have been treated in this country for literally, centuries.
And Hank, engage. I think that's the piece too, is that all of us, this is a city of diversity. This is a city that has great examples of folks living together. Mm-hmm. And folks struggling, no question. Right. But I think that there's an opportunity for us as Fayetteville folks to celebrate that diversity and engage with each other and have the difficult conversations, be willing to roll up the sleeves and learn about each other, just as you modeled for us that night during the demonstration. So, thank you to you and Diane both for doing that and for your willingness to share that story, Hank. I hope that folks will hear that and be inspired by your challenge for all of us to go a little deeper, do the hard work, but not be afraid of that hard work, because where that leads is a place that many of us may sit around and talk about as ideal, but why can't that become a present reality for us?
It's all about empathy and understanding.
Sure.
Taking the effort to learn those stories. Yeah. That understanding is what leads to empathy, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Hank, this has been such a good experience for me, and as I've expressed to our podcast audience, this is our first in person, and we've done so safely. We've separated ourselves here as we continue to live into this pandemic. Hank, I just want to ask you if you have anything to share with our listeners that's a closing thought for them, an encouragement to check out Lafayette Society, whatever's on your heart. I'd love for you to just share that.
Precisely. What I was just thinking, David, and I had thought about this before, but I said I'll save it till the end. You may have read All Quiet on the Western Front, which is probably one of the most remarkable and best novels about World War I. Well, the author wrote another book called The Arch of Triumph. And I picked it up and decided to read it, and it's really kind of fascinating. The main character was a surgeon in Germany, and he fled to France before, during the buildup of the Nazi era. And so he's possibly wanted back in Germany, so he can't really hang out a shingle and practice. But what he does, he's a ghost surgeon. So the society surgeons who have a big name and a big reputation but can't really operate that well, he does the surgery for them as a so-called assistant, right?
Wow, not a ghost writer, a ghost surgeon.
A ghost surgeon. These things existed.
Okay.
But he's just a fascinating character and just a full-fledged character in this book. And there's a scene where he's dating this actress, and he's waiting for her while she's getting prepped. And there's a history book there, and he goes over to it and opens it and thumbs through the pages. And after a while, he just turns away, almost in disgust, because as he said, our heroes, so many, are drenched with blood. And they have done some things that, some of the worst crimes against humanity, but yet they've ended up in the history books. A lot of heroes are drenched in blood. And what it said is, what he said in there is, very few heroes wear the silver halo of kindness.
Wow.
And when you read about Lafayette, that's what you come away with, is he wore the silver halo of kindness.
Silver halo. How about that? Love that. Well, it's inspired me to want to learn more about Lafayette. And I hope that we can all find ways of being engaged with those kind of things that give and drive us and stir within us this passion that you have so shared with us this afternoon.
Sure.
Hank, I appreciate your friendship. I appreciate your being an ambassador for all things in Fayetteville, and for the presence that you and Diane have here in downtown. And just applaud you for all the ways that you are, in my mind, living out justice, freedom, and peace. We want to thank our listeners today. I thank Justin Verrier for being our engineer and always helping us to stay on track with all things through the podcast. Friends, we hope that you'll continue to support us by encouraging other folks to listen to our podcasts. We're on every other Friday episode launch, and we also want to give a thanks to our friends at Cool Spring Downtown District for their efforts in partnering with us as we expand our reach into the community. Thanks all for this time this afternoon. Wherever you may be listening, don't forget to tell your own stories. And thanks again for joining us today on Stories from the Center. Hank, thanks again.
You're welcome.
Blessings
Thank you.
to you.
Thank you.
Okay.